we had the chance to interview Dr. Leah McCabe about the rise of misogyny. Enjoy.
So, thank you for joining me. The panel was very interesting, and of course it was titled The Rise of Misogyny. But what shifts in culture, technology and politics do you think paved the way for this resurgence of toxic masculinity and the sort of anti-feminist mindset?
So I think for me, and something I discussed in the panel, is the far right. The rise of the far right, the populist conservative movements that we see are perpetuating these kind of anti-feminist backlash and the kind of harmful ideas around femininity, around masculinity and the roles of women within society. So I think that these ideas, as I mentioned, that aren't just in the UK, that these movements are very well connected, and we see that particularly playing out in social media. So I think the rise of social media, and particularly young boys, accessing this information that previously they wouldn't have been able to, plays a massive role. And we see influencers such as Andrew Tate playing a massive role in that. And that oftentimes, that, as I say, that these ideas are incredibly harmful around, you know, women's place in society, particularly around sex, and expectations of women and expectations of men and boys as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned Andrew Tate, because I was wondering what your thoughts on people like Kim and others influential people in the manosphere, as it were. Are they just amplifying existing misogynistic currents, or are they simply riding the wave to exploit people's isolation to make profit? And how far has the rhetoric of these once online and very fringe organisations seeped into the cultural mainstream?
So I think they are consciously doing this, and they of course make a lot of money from it. So I think a lot of this is driven by profits, but these harmful ideologies around masculinity and femininity is very much driving it. And it's important to emphasise that misogyny has always existed, but I think social media is just, we're seeing it in different forms, and that they're using this to amplify these ideologies, and they see in many ways it's working, so they're making money from this. So yeah, it's really important to look at these actors and what they're doing, and pushing back against it.
Yeah, do you feel like they've legitimised this point of view for people?
I think for many. So there's recent research that shows that even those who are not seeking out misogynistic content, so particularly in relation to young boys and men, are actually accessing it very quickly. And once you're getting that content on your social media, on TikTok for example, the algorithm is set in a way that you're just constantly then fed that content, and then fed even more harmful content. So I think social media platforms themselves have a lot to answer to, as well as the influencers who use the social media platforms.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you're mentioning, the algorithms, they act as a sort of accelerant to these polarising misogynistic views. And in a digitised landscape, it is very easy to have anonymity as a person online typing and not really getting held accountable. Do you think the current UK legislation is holding these sort of individuals accountable enough, even if it's the influencers or the people being influenced?
So I think it's really problematic, the kind of online abuse that we're seeing targeted at women. And particularly in relation to women in politics, is something I'm very much interested in, a recent project that I've been involved in, and that oftentimes the police don't necessarily respond to it in many ways because it doesn't reach that kind of threshold of criminality. So I think that we do have some kind of questions around whether or not our legal frameworks are appropriate. And I think in relation to social media, it's difficult to respond to things like social media, to AI, to technological advancements, because they happen so quickly that oftentimes what we're seeing is that legislation, policies are kind of trying to respond very quickly, but then AI, etc. also develops very quickly, so then it's often outdated. So I think that what we need to do is to look more closely at things like deepfakes. I think are highly problematic, that I don't think legislation necessarily targets deepfakes appropriately or really understands the kind of gender dynamics of it. The fact that 96% of deepfakes are sexually explicit images that are predominantly of women and girls. I think the focus largely in the kind of political discourse is around how it impacts upon democracy, how it impacts upon elections, which of course is really important, but that's such a small percentage of things like deepfakes that we need to understand the kind of misogynistic aspect of it, which I think sometimes is left out of the conversation.
Yeah, I agree. And so today's world, the backlash against feminism, do you think is a spontaneous cultural recoil, or does it stem from deliberate efforts to undermine progressive gains? And if so, who benefits the most from this resistance?
So I think I sometimes struggle with this idea of a backlash. I do agree in many ways that when progressive change is made by movements like the feminist movement, there will be some form of backlash. But I do think it's a targeted attempt to undermine women's rights. And that we're seeing, again, these kind of global movements influencing each other, spreading kind of the strategies that they're using, what works, testing out in different contexts. So I think we need to understand it's kind of active process. It's not just this passive thing that's happening in response to feminist gains. I think we need to see it as a kind of active movement, which is really pushing for these anti-feminist or these highly problematic gendered ideas and ideologies.
Yeah, and these bad actors, most of the time I'm assuming, wouldn't be in front of the camera, they'll be the ones in the shadows.
Yeah, so I think a lot of times it's pushed by political elites. Sometimes, particularly when we're talking about populism, we can see it's driven by those with money, and that, as you say, not necessarily known to who these people are within the kind of public discourse, which obviously makes it really difficult to target as well.
Yeah, that actually feeds well into the last part of this one. So this is the final question, by the way. In your view, what emerging trend in contemporary misogyny poses the greatest long-term risk, particularly in light of the romanticisation of things like trad wife ideals, resurgence of socially conservative narratives around family and values, and the growing influence of lobby groups that frame the beliefs as cultural preservation rather than ideological regression?
So I think the things like trad wives is really interesting. That for me, we need to understand that within this kind of wider white supremacist ideologies, these conservative ideologies, that it's not just about trad wives, it's a bigger picture. And I think we need to understand it as such, how these issues are all interconnected with each other. But I think technological advancements for me is the thing that we need to really be keeping our eye on, and ensuring that there's clear regulation by the government of these large social media conglomerates, and ensuring that there's things that they can do to prevent violence from happening in the first place and addressing the issue.
So do you think it's always going to be a losing battle since technology, like you said, moves so fast, whereas like Parliament, stuff like that, normally take a long time to pass any sort of legislation? Is there a way that we can ever be in front of stuff like this happening?
So I think you're right in saying that the process of passing legislation is often, a long drawn out process, and there's not necessarily something we can do. We don't want to circumvent that. But I think it's ensuring that we're having these conversations like we had today, that we are aware of what's going on, ensuring that there's activism, that there's academics looking into this, really kind of pushing for government responses, and hopefully kind of lobbying social media platforms themselves to ensure that, this is best practice. You should be doing this for the well-being of all, putting people, above profits, which, is easier said than done. So I think it's just really kind of pushing a drive and educating people as well of the kind of harmful content that they are, reading, seeing, listening to, and the kind of problematic aspects towards it. So I think education, early education, plays a really important role within this.
Hopefully one day we get there, yeah.
Fingers crossed. I mean, I am optimistic. I think that we oftentimes, when we're talking about the kind of rise of these movements, the rise of misogyny, it is a very depressing outlook. Of course it is, but I do think there are fantastic organisations, activists, or different actors who are driving this work. So hopefully, together we can make meaningful change.
I'd like to thank you again for joining me.
Thank you.